The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones of Ravenshollow Court with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of Miss Charlotte Pemberton's heart as she approached what would either be her salvation or her downfall. Through the rain-streaked windows, she caught her first glimpse of the imposing Gothic mansion that had housed the Dukes of Ravenshollow for over 3 centuries, its dark towers rising against the grey October sky like accusations against heaven itself. At 24, Charlotte had accepted the position of governess to the Duke's 3 children, not out of choice, but out of desperate necessity. Her father's gambling debts had left the family in ruins, and her only alternatives had been marriage to a man 40 years her senior, or employment in a household that would provide both income and respectability. What she had not expected was to find herself at the centre of the most rigid, grief-stricken household in all of England, where the very mention of laughter was considered a betrayal of the late Duchess's memory. His Grace the Duke of Ravenshollow, Adrian Blackwood, had been widowed for 2 years, and in that time had transformed from one of London's most charming and sociable nobles into a man so consumed by grief and duty that he had forgotten how to live. His children, Lady Margaret, aged 12, Lord James, aged 10, and little Lady Catherine, aged 6, had been raised by a succession of stern governesses who understood that their primary duty was to maintain the solemn atmosphere that their father believed appropriate to their station. What none of them anticipated was that Miss Charlotte Pemberton would arrive with ideas about education, childhood, and healing that would challenge everything they thought they knew about proper behavior in a house of mourning. Within a week of her arrival, Charlotte would do something so shocking, so unprecedented, that it would send ripples of scandal through the highest levels of society and force a grieving duke to confront the possibility that perhaps it was time to let the dead rest and the living truly live again. Stay with me until sorrow transforms into joy and a house of shadows learns to welcome light. Charlotte's first glimpse of her new charges came during the formal interview that preceded her employment, and what she saw broke her heart in ways she had not anticipated. The 3 Blackwood children sat in the Duke's study like perfectly arranged dolls, their backs straight, their hands folded, their expressions carefully neutral. They were beautiful children. Lady Margaret with her father's dark hair and serious grey eyes, Lord James with the stubborn chin that marked him as a true Blackwood heir, and little Lady Catherine with golden curls that seemed to be the only bright thing in the entire room. But there was no light in their eyes, no spark of childhood mischief or curiosity. They answered Charlotte's questions with the mechanical precision of adults, their voices carefully modulated to avoid any hint of enthusiasm or spontaneity. "Lady Margaret," Charlotte said gently, "what subjects do you most enjoy studying?" "I find all subjects equally instructive, Miss Pemberton," the girl replied with the kind of formal politeness that belonged in a diplomatic reception rather than a schoolroom. "I believe it is my duty to excel in whatever areas of study are deemed appropriate for my station." "And what do you enjoy doing when your lessons are finished?" Lady Margaret glanced nervously at her father before responding. "I practice my needlework and read improving literature, Miss Pemberton. I find that idle pursuits are inappropriate given our family's circumstances." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. These children had been taught to suppress their natural impulses so thoroughly that they had forgotten how to be children at all. "Lord James," she continued, "do you have any particular interests? Perhaps in natural history or mathematics?" "I study what is required of me, Miss Pemberton," the boy replied with the same careful neutrality. "Father says that a future duke must be prepared for his responsibilities, not distracted by frivolous pursuits." "And Lady Catherine? What makes you happy, sweetheart?" The little girl looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "I try to be good, Miss Pemberton. I try not to make noise or cause trouble. Papa says that good children are quiet children." Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she realized the extent of the emotional damage that had been inflicted on these innocent souls. They had been taught that their natural impulses were somehow disrespectful to their mother's memory, that joy itself was a betrayal of proper mourning. "Miss Pemberton," came the Duke's voice from behind his massive desk, "I trust you understand the particular requirements of this position. My children have been through a great deal, and they require stability, discipline, and respect for the gravity of their situation." Charlotte turned to study the man who had hired her, seeing for the first time the full extent of his own transformation. The Duke of Ravenshollow had once been considered one of London's most eligible bachelors, renowned for his wit, his charm, and his devotion to his beautiful wife. The man who sat before her now was a shadow of that former self, still handsome, but with lines of grief etched deeply around his eyes and a manner that suggested he had forgotten how to smile. "Your Grace," Charlotte said carefully, "I understand that your family has endured a terrible loss. However, I believe that children require more than just discipline and gravity. They need intellectual stimulation, physical activity, and the opportunity to experience joy even in the midst of sorrow." The Duke's expression grew cold at her words. "Miss Pemberton, my children's mother died in childbirth attempting to give me a fourth heir. They understand that life is not about joy, it is about duty, responsibility, and honoring those who have gone before us. I expect you to reinforce these lessons, not undermine them." "Of course, Your Grace," Charlotte replied, though something in her tone suggested that she had her own ideas about what the children needed. "I will certainly emphasize the importance of duty and responsibility, but I also believe that the best way to honor the memory of the late Duchess is to raise her children to be happy, healthy, and well-educated individuals who can contribute meaningfully to the world. The late Duchess would have wanted her children to comport themselves with dignity and restraint," the Duke said firmly. "Miss Pemberton, I hope I make myself clear. This is a house of mourning, and it will remain so until I decide otherwise." "Perfectly clear, Your Grace," Charlotte said, though the spark in her green eyes suggested that she had no intention of allowing these children to waste away in artificial grief. Charlotte's first few days at Ravenshollow Court were spent observing the rigid routine that governed every aspect of the children's lives. They rose at 6, dressed in somber colors that seemed designed to remind them constantly of their loss, ate their meals in silence, and spent their days in lessons that emphasized duty, propriety, and the weight of their aristocratic heritage. "Miss Pemberton," Lady Margaret said during their first formal lesson, "Miss Hartwell always began our day with a recitation of our family motto and a moment of silent reflection on our dear Mamma's memory. Should we not continue this practice?" Charlotte studied the girl's pale face, noting the way she held herself with the rigid posture of someone far older than her 12 years. "Lady Margaret, what was your mother like? Not as a duchess, but as a person, as your mamma?" The question seemed to catch the girl off guard. She was very beautiful, Miss Pemberton, and very proper. She always said that a lady's greatest virtue was her ability to maintain dignity in all circumstances." "And did she laugh? Did she play games with you? Did she tell you stories or sing you lullabies?" Lady Margaret's composure wavered slightly. I remember her singing sometimes, when she thought no one was listening. She had a beautiful voice." "Then perhaps the best way to honor her memory would be to remember the joy she brought to your lives, not just the sorrow of her passing," Charlotte suggested gently. "What do you think she would want for you now? Would she want you to be happy, or would she want you to spend your entire childhood in mourning?" "Papa says that proper mourning shows respect, and I'm sure your papa is right about many things," Charlotte interrupted gently. "But sweetheart, your mama loved you. Don't you think she would want you to grow up to be happy, accomplished young people, rather than sad little ghosts haunting the halls of your own home?" It was Lord James who provided the answer that would change everything. "Miss Pemberton, do you really think Mamma would want us to be happy, even without her?" "I think your Mamma would want you to carry her love with you always, but not her sorrow," Charlotte said firmly. "I think she would want you to learn and grow and become the remarkable people you were meant to be, and I think she would want you to find joy in life, even as you remember her with love." Little Lady Catherine, who had been listening with the intensity that marked all her interactions, suddenly spoke up with a question that would haunt Charlotte for days to come. "Miss Pemberton, if we're happy, will Papa be angry with us?" The question revealed the true tragedy of the situation. These children had been taught to suppress their natural joy, not just out of respect for their mother's memory, but out of fear of their father's disapproval. They had learned that happiness was somehow a betrayal of the grief that had consumed their household. "Lady Catherine," Charlotte said, kneeling down to the little girl's level, "your papa loves you very much. He's just forgotten how to show it because he's been so sad about losing your mama, but I don't think he would be angry if you were happy. I think he might remember how to be happy too." "Do you really think so?" the child whispered, her eyes wide with hope. "I think it's worth finding out," Charlotte said with a smile that was the first genuine expression of warmth these children had seen in months. That afternoon, Charlotte made the decision that would shock the entire household and set in motion a chain of events that would transform Ravenshollow Court forever. Instead of conducting the usual formal lessons in the schoolroom, she led the children outside to the estate's magnificent gardens, which had been neglected since the Duchess's death. "Miss Pemberton," Lady Margaret said nervously as they walked among the overgrown rose bushes, "are we permitted to be out here?" Miss Hartwell always said that the gardens were not appropriate for children without proper supervision. I am your proper supervision, Charlotte replied cheerfully, and I believe that nature provides the best classroom for many of our most important lessons. What sort of lessons? Lord James asked, his curiosity beginning to overcome his trained reserve. Botany, for instance. Can you identify the different types of roses growing here? And mathematics. We could measure the garden plots and calculate their areas. And literature. Many of the greatest poets have written about gardens and the changing seasons. For the first time since Charlotte's arrival, she saw a spark of genuine interest in the children's eyes. Lady Margaret began examining the rose bushes with scientific curiosity. Lord James started counting the garden sections with mathematical precision, and little Lady Catherine simply ran among the flowers with the kind of unconscious joy that had been missing from her life for too long. It was this scene, the three Blackwood heirs actually behaving like children, laughing and exploring and learning with enthusiasm, that the Duke discovered when he returned from his morning ride. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the garden with the force of a thunderclap. Charlotte turned to face him, her chin raised with the kind of quiet defiance that suggested she had been expecting this confrontation. "Your Grace, we are conducting our afternoon lessons. The children are studying botany, mathematics, and natural history. In the gardens, without proper supervision." "Miss Pemberton, this is highly irregular. The children are under my supervision, Your Grace, and I am their governess. Surely that qualifies as proper supervision for educational activities." The Duke's grey eyes flashed with anger as he took in the sight of his children with dirt on their clothes, flowers in their hair, and expressions of guilty pleasure on their faces. "Miss Pemberton, my children are not common village children who can be allowed to run wild in the gardens. They are the heirs to one of England's oldest dukedoms, and they must comport themselves accordingly." "Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension, "your children are also human beings who need fresh air, physical activity, and the opportunity to explore the world around them. Keeping them confined to stuffy schoolrooms is not preparing them for their future responsibilities. It's stunting their intellectual and emotional development." "You forget yourself, Miss Pemberton," the Duke said coldly. "I did not hire you to revolutionize my children's education. I hired you to provide them with appropriate instruction in a manner consistent with their station and their circumstances. And I am providing them with appropriate instruction," Charlotte replied firmly. "Your Grace, these children are brilliant, curious, and eager to learn, but they've been taught to suppress their natural impulses so thoroughly that they're in danger of becoming mere shadows of what they could be. They have been taught proper behavior. They have been taught to be afraid of their own happiness," Charlotte interrupted, her voice rising with passion. "Your Grace, with all due respect, your children are not honoring their mother's memory by living like little ghosts. They're dishonoring it by refusing to embrace the life she gave them." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Charlotte realized that she had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. The Duke's face had gone white with rage, and she could see the children watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Miss Pemberton," the Duke said with deadly quiet, "you will return my children to the house immediately and report to my study. We will discuss whether your employment here will continue." As Charlotte led the subdued children back to Ravenshollow Court, she wondered if her first week would also be her last. But as little Lady Catherine slipped her small hand into Charlotte's, she knew that whatever the consequences, she had done the right thing. These children deserved better than a life of artificial grief, and she was going to fight for their right to be happy, even if it cost her everything. The Duke, who had buried his heart with his wife, was about to discover that some battles were worth fighting, and that the governess he had hired to maintain order was actually the catalyst for the kind of change that would transform not just his children's lives, but his own. The confrontation in the Duke's study that evening was unlike anything Charlotte had experienced in her sheltered life as a country vicar's daughter. The room itself seemed designed to intimidate, with its dark wood paneling, imposing portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the massive desk behind which the Duke sat like a judge, preparing to pronounce sentence. "Miss Pemberton," he began without preamble, "in the 3 days since your arrival, you have disrupted the established routine of this household, encouraged my children to behave in ways that are inconsistent with their station, and now you have had the audacity to criticize my methods of child-rearing. Explain to me why I should not dismiss you immediately." Charlotte had spent the afternoon preparing for this moment, and she faced the Duke with a composure that surprised them both. "Your Grace, I was hired to educate your children and prepare them for their future roles in society. I cannot do that effectively if they are not allowed to develop their natural intellectual curiosity and emotional resilience. My children's emotional state is not your concern. With respect, Your Grace, it is entirely my concern, Charlotte interrupted, her green eyes flashing with determination. You cannot separate intellectual development from emotional well-being. Children who are afraid to express curiosity, to ask questions, to explore their environment, cannot learn effectively. My children are perfectly capable of learning. Your children are terrified of disappointing you, Charlotte said bluntly. They have been taught that any expression of joy or spontaneity is somehow a betrayal of their mother's memory. Your Grace, they are not learning. They are merely parroting back what they think you want to hear. The Duke's jaw tightened at her words. Miss Pemberton, you have been in this house for 3 days. I have been raising my children for 12 years. I think I am better qualified to judge what they need. Are you? Charlotte asked, her voice softening slightly. Your Grace, when was the last time you had a real conversation with Lady Margaret? Not about her lessons or her deportment, but about her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. When was the last time you played with Lord James or told Lady Catherine a bedtime story? Those are not appropriate activities for a man in my position. They are the most important activities for a man in your position, Charlotte said passionately. Your Grace, you are not just a duke, you are a father. Your children need your love and attention more than they need your formal approval. The Duke stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back rigid with tension. Miss Pemberton, you do not understand the responsibilities that come with our position. My children are not ordinary children who can be allowed to run wild and indulge their every whim. They are the future of one of England's oldest families, and they must be prepared for the weight of that inheritance. I understand that perfectly, Charlotte replied. But, Your Grace, the best preparation for leadership is not rigid conformity to rules. It's the development of independent thought, moral courage, and the ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Your children will never be effective leaders if they're afraid to think for themselves. They are not afraid. Lady Catherine asked me today if you would be angry with her for being happy, Charlotte said quietly. Your Grace, your 6-year-old daughter is afraid that expressing joy will earn your disapproval. Is that really the legacy you want to leave? The words hit the Duke like physical blows, and Charlotte saw his shoulders sag slightly as the truth of her observation sank in. Miss Pemberton, My children understand that we are still in mourning for their mother. It would be inappropriate for them to behave as if nothing had happened. No one is suggesting that they forget their mother or pretend that nothing happened, Charlotte said gently. But, Your Grace, it has been 2 years. Your children have spent 1/3 of their lives in artificial mourning. At what point does honoring your wife's memory become dishonoring her children's futures? The Duke turned from the window to face her, and Charlotte was shocked to see pain rather than anger in his grey eyes. Miss Pemberton, you speak as if grief has an expiration date, as if there is some prescribed time after which one should simply move on. I speak as someone who believes that the dead would want the living to truly live, Charlotte replied softly. Your Grace, I lost my mother when I was 14. I understand the pain of such a loss, and I understand the temptation to hold on to grief as a way of holding on to the person we've lost. But I also learned that the best way to honor my mother's memory was to become the woman she would have wanted me to be, not to spend my life as a monument to her absence. The Duke stared at her for a long moment, and Charlotte had the sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. You lost your mother at 14? Yes, Your Grace, to consumption. It was very difficult for my father and myself. We struggled with how to continue living when someone so central to our lives was gone. And how did you manage to move forward? Charlotte was quiet for a moment, remembering those dark days when grief had threatened to consume her entire family. We realized that my mother would have been heartbroken to see us wasting the lives she had worked so hard to nurture. She would have wanted us to carry her love with us, but not her sorrow. She would have wanted us to find joy again, even though she couldn't share it with us. And you believe that my wife would have wanted the same for our children? I believe any mother would want her children to be happy, healthy, and whole, Charlotte said firmly. Your Grace, I never knew the late Duchess, but I have to believe that she loved her children enough to want them to thrive, not just survive. The Duke moved back to his desk and sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. Miss Pemberton, I have tried to do what I thought was best for my children. I wanted them to understand the gravity of their loss, to respect their mother's memory, to comport themselves with appropriate dignity. And you have succeeded in teaching them those things, Charlotte said gently. But, Your Grace, you have also taught them to be afraid of their own emotions, to suppress their natural curiosity, to view happiness as somehow inappropriate. Is that really what you intended? No, the Duke admitted quietly. No, that was not my intention. Then perhaps it's time to consider a different approach, Charlotte suggested. Your Grace, your children are remarkable. Lady Margaret has a brilliant mind that could excel in any field she chooses to pursue. Lord James has the kind of natural leadership ability that could make him an exceptional duke, and Lady Catherine has a sweetness and empathy that could bring joy to everyone around her, but none of these qualities can develop properly if they're constantly suppressed. What are you suggesting, Miss Pemberton? I am suggesting that we allow your children to be children, while we prepare them to be adults, Charlotte said. I'm suggesting that we teach them that strength comes from understanding and managing emotions, not from suppressing them. I'm suggesting that we show them that their mother's greatest gift to them was life itself, and that the best way to honor that gift is to live it fully. The Duke was quiet for a long time, his grey eyes fixed on the portrait of his late wife that hung above the fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Miss Pemberton, if I were to allow you to implement these changes you suggest, what would that look like? What would you do differently? Charlotte felt a surge of hope at his words. I would create an educational program that challenges your children intellectually while allowing them to explore their interests and develop their individual talents. I would encourage physical activity and outdoor exploration as part of their daily routine. I would teach them that emotions, including joy, are natural and healthy parts of human experience. And their deportment, their understanding of their responsibilities, would be enhanced, not diminished, Charlotte said firmly. Your Grace, children who are confident in themselves and comfortable with their emotions are far better equipped to handle the pressures of leadership than children who have been taught to fear their own feelings. Miss Pemberton, I am not certain I am ready for such dramatic changes. My children's current routine has provided stability during a very difficult time. Then we make the changes gradually, Charlotte suggested. We introduce new elements slowly, allowing everyone to adjust. But Your Grace, we must make some changes. Your children are not thriving under the current system. They are merely surviving. The Duke looked at her with an expression that seemed to combine hope and fear in equal measure. Miss Pemberton, if I agree to give you more latitude in your methods, I need your assurance that you will not undermine the respect my children have for their mother's memory or their understanding of their social obligations. You have my word, Your Grace, Charlotte said solemnly. I will never ask your children to forget their mother or to abandon their responsibilities. I will simply ask them to embrace the life she gave them and to prepare for the future she would have wanted them to have. Very well, the Duke said after another long pause. Miss Pemberton, I am willing to observe the results of your methods for a trial period. But I warn you, if I see any deterioration in my children's behavior or any disrespect for their position, I will not hesitate to dismiss you. I understand, Your Grace, and I promise you will not regret this decision. As Charlotte left the Duke's study that evening, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had just accepted. She had convinced a grieving father to trust her with his children's futures, and she was determined to prove that love and joy were not enemies of discipline and duty, but their greatest allies. The transformation of Ravenshollow Court was about to begin, and Charlotte had the feeling that by the time it was complete, nothing would ever be the same again. The changes began subtly, so gradually that even the Duke might not have noticed them if he had not been watching with the careful attention of a man who had staked his children's futures on an untested theory. Charlotte introduced what she called practical lessons, mathematics taught through garden planning, history learned through exploration of the estate's ancient rooms, literature brought to life through dramatic readings that allowed the children to express emotions they had long suppressed. Miss Pemberton, Lady Margaret said one morning as they worked together to design a new herb garden, I never realized that mathematics could be so interesting. Miss Hartwell always made it seem like a series of abstract problems with no real purpose. Mathematics is everywhere around us, Charlotte replied, watching with satisfaction as the girl's natural intelligence began to emerge from behind the mask of dutiful compliance. Architecture, music, nature, commerce, all of these depend on mathematical principles. When you understand how numbers work in the real world, they become tools for creation rather than just exercises for the mind. Could I design something myself? Perhaps a reading garden where we could hold our literature lessons outdoors. Charlotte felt a thrill of triumph at the question. This was the first time Lady Margaret had expressed a personal desire for anything beyond fulfilling her expected duties. I think that's a wonderful idea. Why don't you work on some preliminary sketches, and we can discuss the practical requirements. The transformation was even more dramatic in Lord James, whose natural leadership abilities began to emerge as Charlotte gave him opportunities to take responsibility for real projects rather than just theoretical exercises. "Miss Pemberton," he said one afternoon as they toured the estate's tenant farms, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding a future duke's responsibilities to his people. Could we perhaps visit some of the tenant families? I should like to understand their circumstances better." "An excellent idea," Charlotte agreed. "Her duke, who understands the lives of those who depend on him, will be far more effective than one who rules from a distance." "Father has never taken us to visit the tenants," Lord James said thoughtfully. "I think he believes such interactions are inappropriate for children of our station. Perhaps your father simply hasn't considered the educational value of such visits," Charlotte suggested diplomatically. "Why don't you prepare some questions about agricultural practices and estate management? If you approach it as a scholarly exercise, he might be more receptive to the idea." But it was little Lady Catherine who provided the most dramatic evidence of the changes taking place at Ravenshollow Court. The solemn, frightened child who had arrived at Charlotte's first interview began to blossom into the bright, affectionate little girl she had been meant to be. "Miss Pemberton," she said one evening as Charlotte tucked her into bed, "do you think Mamma would like the flower crown I made today?" Charlotte felt her heart clench at the question. Lady Catherine had spent the afternoon weaving wildflowers into a delicate circlet, her face glowing with the kind of innocent joy that had been missing from her life for so long. "I think your Mamma would love it, sweetheart. I think she would be so proud to see what a creative, loving little girl you've become." "Miss Pemberton, do you think Mamma can see us, even though she's in heaven?" "I think your Mamma's love is always with you," Charlotte said gently. "I think she watches over you and wants you to be happy and healthy and kind. Then it's all right for me to be happy sometimes, even though she's not here?" "Oh, sweetheart," Charlotte said, gathering the little girl into her arms, "it's not just all right. It's what she would want most in the world. Your happiness doesn't mean you love her any less. It means you're living the life she gave you." These conversations and transformations did not go unnoticed by the Duke, who found himself observing his children with a mixture of wonder and unease. They were still respectful, still well-behaved, still conscious of their duties, but they were also becoming recognizably human in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. "Miss Pemberton," he said one evening when he encountered her in the library, where she was preparing lessons for the following day, "I have been observing the changes in my children's behavior, and I confess myself uncertain about some of what I see." Charlotte looked up from her books, noting the troubled expression on his face. "What concerns you, Your Grace?" "They seem different. More animated, more willing to express opinions, more alive, I suppose. But I worry that in encouraging this liveliness, we may be undermining the discipline and restraint that their positions require." "Your Grace, may I ask you something?" Charlotte said, setting down her pen to give him her full attention. "When you think about the kind of adults you want your children to become, what qualities do you hope they will possess?" The Duke considered the question seriously. "I want them to be honorable, responsible, capable of making difficult decisions for the good of others. I want them to understand their duties and fulfill them without complaint. I want them to be worthy of the trust that will be placed in them." "And do you believe that children who are afraid to think independently, who suppress their natural curiosity, who view their own emotions as dangerous, do you believe such children will grow into adults capable of making wise decisions and inspiring others to follow them?" I had not considered the question in those terms. Your Grace, the qualities you want your children to develop, honor, responsibility, wisdom, these grow from confidence, not fear. A child who has been encouraged to explore ideas, to question assumptions, to understand and manage emotions, will become an adult capable of true leadership. A child who has been taught only to obey and suppress will become an adult who can only follow rules, not create them. The Duke moved to the window, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Pemberton, I see the logic in what you say, but I also see my children behaving in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago." Lady Catherine laughed so loudly at dinner yesterday that the footman stared. Lord James questioned one of my decisions about estate management. Lady Margaret expressed an opinion about politics that contradicted something I had said earlier. And how did you respond to these behaviors? I was not certain how to respond. Part of me was pleased to see them so engaged, but part of me worried that they were becoming too familiar, too willing to forget their place. Charlotte stood and moved closer to him, her expression serious. Your Grace, your children are not forgetting their place. They are learning to inhabit it with confidence rather than fear. A future duke who can question decisions and think independently will be far more effective than one who simply follows precedent. A future duchess who can express her opinions clearly will be better equipped to fulfill her social obligations, and a little girl who can laugh freely will grow into a woman capable of bringing joy to others. But the propriety is enhanced, not diminished by genuine confidence. Charlotte interrupted gently. Your Grace, true propriety comes from understanding why certain behaviors are appropriate, not from blind adherence to rules. Your children are learning to behave well, because they understand the reasons behind proper behavior, not because they're afraid of punishment. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Miss Pemberton, I find myself remembering my wife more clearly since you arrived, not just her death but her life. She was very much like what my children are becoming, lively, curious, unafraid to express her thoughts and feelings. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. And I realize now that in my grief, I may have been trying to protect my children from becoming too much like her, because I was afraid of losing them the way I lost her. Charlotte felt her heart break for this man who had been so consumed by grief that he had forgotten how to live. Your Grace, you cannot protect your children from life by teaching them to fear it. The best protection you can give them is the strength and confidence to face whatever challenges come their way. And you believe that allowing them to express joy, to explore their interests, to behave more naturally will give them that strength. I believe that children who are comfortable with themselves and confident in their abilities will be far better equipped to handle the pressures of their positions than children who have been taught to suppress their natural impulses, Charlotte said firmly. The Duke turned from the window to face her directly, and Charlotte was struck by the vulnerability in his expression. Miss Pemberton, I want to trust your judgment in this matter, but I confess that I am terrified of making the wrong choice for my children. Your Grace, the fact that you care so deeply about making the right choice proves that you are a good father. Trust yourself and trust your children. They are remarkable young people who will thrive if given the opportunity. And if I were to become more involved in their daily lives, more willing to engage with them as individuals rather than just as my heirs, do you think that would be beneficial? Charlotte felt a surge of hope at his question. I think it would be the most beneficial thing you could possibly do. Your Grace, your children need your love and attention more than they need your formal approval. They need to know that you value them as people, not just as representatives of the family name. I am not certain I remember how to be that kind of father. It has been so long since I allowed myself to simply enjoy my children's company. Then perhaps it's time to relearn, Charlotte suggested gently. Your Grace, your children are wonderful. Spend time with them, talk to them, listen to their ideas and dreams. You might be surprised by how much you enjoy their company when you're not constantly worried about their deportment. That evening, for the first time in 2 years, the Duke joined his children for their bedtime routine. Charlotte watched from the doorway as he listened to Lady Catherine's excited account of her day, discussed Lord James's questions about estate management, and admired Lady Margaret's sketches for the reading garden. And for the first time since his wife's death, the Duke of Ravenshollow smiled, not the polite, formal expression he wore in public, but a genuine smile of paternal love and pride. The transformation of Ravenshollow Court was accelerating, and Charlotte had the feeling that the most dramatic changes were yet to come. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an unexpected visitor whose arrival would test everything that Charlotte and the Duke had built together. Lady Pemberton, Charlotte's own aunt and one of society's most formidable arbiters of propriety, descended upon Ravenshollow Court like an avenging angel, her disapproval evident from the moment her carriage wheels touched the estate's gravel drive. Charlotte, she announced without preamble as she swept into the drawing room where Charlotte was taking tea with the children, I have come to see for myself the reports that have been reaching London about your unconventional methods of education. Charlotte felt her blood run cold as she realized that word of the changes at Ravenshollow had somehow reached the gossip networks of London society. Aunt Pemberton, how lovely to see you. Children, please make your curtsy to Lady Pemberton. The three Blackwood children rose and performed their formal greetings with perfect grace, but Charlotte could see the confusion in their eyes. They had grown accustomed to the warmth and informality that had characterized their lives for the past month, and Lady Pemberton's cold formality was a jarring reminder of the world beyond Ravenshollow's walls. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said, turning to the Duke, who had appeared in response to the commotion, "I hope you will forgive my unexpected arrival, but I felt it necessary to discuss certain concerns that have come to my attention regarding my niece's performance in your household." "What sort of concerns?" the Duke asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Concerns about the propriety of allowing children of such elevated station to behave in ways that would be considered inappropriate, even for the offspring of country squires," Lady Pemberton replied with cutting precision. "Your Grace, I have received reports that your children have been seen running through the gardens, engaging in manual labor, and expressing themselves with a freedom that is entirely inconsistent with their positions." Charlotte felt the Duke's gaze upon her, and she could see the doubt beginning to creep into his expression. "Lady Pemberton, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately. I think the children should hear this conversation," Lady Pemberton interrupted. "They need to understand the consequences of their recent behavior and the importance of returning to more appropriate conduct." "Aunt Pemberton," Charlotte said carefully, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of the children's activities." "There is no misunderstanding, Charlotte. I have it on excellent authority that Lady Margaret has been seen with dirt under her fingernails, that Lord James has been observed speaking familiarly with tenant farmers, and that Lady Catherine has been heard laughing loudly enough to disturb the servants. Such behavior is absolutely unacceptable for children of their station." Charlotte watched in horror as the children's faces began to close off, their expressions returning to the careful neutrality that had characterized them before her arrival. They were remembering that the joy and freedom they had experienced were somehow wrong, somehow inappropriate to their positions. "Furthermore," Lady Pemberton continued, "I understand that you have been encouraging these children to express opinions on subjects far beyond their understanding, to question the decisions of their betters, and to behave with a familiarity that borders on impertinence. Charlotte, I am shocked that you would so thoroughly misunderstand your role in this household." "Lady Pemberton," the Duke said quietly, "perhaps you could explain exactly what reports you have received and from whom." "I have received reports from several sources, Your Grace, all of whom are concerned about the reputation of one of England's most distinguished families. There are those who question whether Miss Pemberton's innovative methods are producing children who will be capable of fulfilling their future obligations with appropriate dignity." Charlotte felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. "Your Grace, I can explain—" "What needs to be explained," Lady Pemberton said coldly, "is how a governess with no experience in educating children of noble birth came to believe that she could revolutionize methods that have successfully produced generations of distinguished leaders. The methods that produced generations of distinguished leaders also produced generations of unhappy, emotionally stunted individuals who ruled through fear rather than inspiration," Charlotte said, her temper finally overcoming her discretion. "Aunt Pemberton, the world is changing, and the children of today need different skills than the children of previous generations. The world may be changing, but the fundamental requirements of noble birth remain constant," Lady Pemberton replied with icy authority. "Children of elevated station must learn restraint, discipline, and respect for hierarchy. They cannot be allowed to believe that their personal desires and opinions are more important than their duties to family and society." "No one is suggesting that personal desires should override duty," Charlotte protested. "But surely duty can be fulfilled with joy rather than grim resignation. Surely children can be taught to embrace their responsibilities rather than simply endure them." "Such romantic notions are precisely the problem," Lady Pemberton said dismissively. "Charlotte, you have filled these children's heads with ideas about happiness and self-expression that are entirely inappropriate to their circumstances. You have taught them to value their own feelings over the expectations of society." Charlotte looked at the children, seeing the confusion and growing fear in their eyes as they listened to this condemnation of everything they had learned to value about themselves. Lady Margaret's shoulders had returned to their rigid posture. Lord James had assumed the expressionless mask that had characterized him before Charlotte's arrival, and little Lady Catherine looked as if she might cry. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton continued, turning to address the Duke directly. I strongly recommend that you dismiss Miss Pemberton immediately and engage a governess with proper understanding of what is required for children of your station. The damage that has been done may still be reversible if action is taken quickly. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes moving from Lady Pemberton to Charlotte to his children, who stood frozen in the middle of the room like statues. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Lady Pemberton, I appreciate your concern for my children's welfare. However, I believe I am the best judge of what is appropriate for their education and development. Your Grace, with all due respect, you have been so consumed by grief that you may not be seeing the situation clearly. These children need firm guidance and proper discipline, not the indulgent methods that Miss Pemberton has employed. The methods that Miss Pemberton has employed have produced remarkable improvements in my children's intellectual development, emotional well-being, and general happiness, the Duke said firmly. Lady Pemberton, I have seen my children grow and thrive under her guidance in ways that I had not thought possible. Growth and thriving are not the same as proper preparation for their future roles, Lady Pemberton insisted. Your Grace, these children will one day be among the most powerful people in England. They cannot be allowed to believe that their personal happiness is more important than their obligations to their class and their country. And they have not been taught to believe that, Charlotte said desperately. Lady Pemberton, these children understand their responsibilities better than ever before because they understand the reasons behind them. They are learning to lead through inspiration rather than intimidation, to serve others with joy rather than grim duty. Such idealistic nonsense, Lady Pemberton said with obvious disgust. Charlotte, you have no understanding of the realities of noble life. These children will face pressures and expectations that cannot be met through inspiration and joy. They need strength, discipline, and the ability to suppress their personal desires in service of their greater obligations. They need confidence, wisdom, and the emotional resilience to handle whatever challenges they face, Charlotte countered. Aunt Pemberton, children who are comfortable with themselves and secure in their abilities will be far better equipped to handle pressure than children who have been taught to fear their own emotions. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice. Little Lady Catherine, who had been listening with growing distress, suddenly stepped forward with the kind of courage that surprised everyone in the room. Lady Pemberton, she said in her clear, sweet voice, Miss Pemberton has not taught us to forget our duties. She has taught us to love them. She has shown us that we can honor Mama's memory by being happy, not just by being sad. She has helped us understand that being a duke or duchess means helping people, not just ruling them. The room fell silent as everyone stared at the 6-year-old who had just delivered the most eloquent defense of Charlotte's methods that anyone could have imagined. Lady Pemberton looked shocked that a child would dare to speak so directly to an adult, while the Duke's expression showed a mixture of pride and amazement at his daughter's courage. Lady Catherine, Lady Pemberton said coldly, children should not express opinions on matters they do not understand. Your governess has clearly failed to teach you proper respect for your elders. Miss Pemberton has taught me to respect people who deserve respect, Lady Catherine replied, with the kind of innocent honesty that cut deeper than any adult argument. She has taught me that being noble means being good, not just being important. Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she realized that this brave little girl was risking everything to defend the woman who had given her back her childhood. But she also knew that Lady Catherine's courage might not be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said with obvious frustration, I hope you can see from this display exactly what I mean about inappropriate behavior. This child has been taught to argue with her betters, to express opinions that are far beyond her understanding, to behave with a familiarity that would be shocking in a servant, let alone a duke's daughter. The Duke looked at his youngest daughter, who stood with her chin raised and her violet eyes bright with determination, and Charlotte could see him struggling with the competing demands of social expectation and paternal pride. Lady Catherine, he said gently, thank you for sharing your thoughts. You may go to the nursery now. Miss Pemberton and I need to discuss some adult matters. As the children filed out of the room, Charlotte felt her heart breaking for the confusion and fear she saw in their faces. They had tasted freedom and joy, and now they were being told that such things were inappropriate for people of their station. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said once they were alone, I hope you can see that immediate action is required. Miss Pemberton has clearly overstepped her bounds and filled your children's heads with dangerous ideas about their own importance and the value of their personal feelings. "Lady Pemberton," the Duke said quietly, "I need time to consider what you have said. This is not a decision that can be made hastily." "Your Grace, every day that passes allows these inappropriate ideas to become more deeply entrenched. The longer you wait, the more difficult it will be to undo the damage that has been done." Charlotte felt panic rising in her chest as she realized that everything she had worked for, everything the children had gained, was about to be destroyed by the rigid expectations of a society that valued conformity over growth, obedience over wisdom. "Your Grace," she said desperately, "please give me the opportunity to prove that the children's development has been beneficial rather than harmful. Allow me to demonstrate that they are better prepared for their future roles, not less prepared." "Miss Pemberton," Lady Pemberton said coldly, "you have had quite enough opportunity to demonstrate your methods. The results speak for themselves." As Charlotte looked at the Duke's troubled face, she realized that the battle for the children's futures was far from over, but she also knew that she would fight for them with everything she had, because some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice. The question was whether love and joy would prove stronger than tradition and fear, and whether a grieving father would have the courage to choose his children's happiness over society's approval. The decision came at dawn, delivered in the form of a summons to the Duke's study that Charlotte received with trembling hands. She had spent the night pacing her small chamber, preparing arguments and defenses that she prayed would be sufficient to save not just her position, but the progress the children had made toward becoming whole, healthy human beings. "Miss Pemberton," the Duke said as she entered the study where he stood silhouetted against the tall windows, "I have spent the night considering Lady Pemberton's concerns and my own observations of my children's development under your guidance." Charlotte felt her heart stop as she waited for the words that would either vindicate her methods or destroy everything she had worked to build. "Your Grace, I have concluded," the Duke continued, turning to face her with an expression she could not read, "that Lady Pemberton's concerns, while well-intentioned, are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what true nobility requires." Charlotte felt her knees go weak with relief, but the Duke was not finished. "However, I have also concluded that some modifications to your methods may be necessary to address the legitimate concerns about my children's preparation for their future roles in society." "What sort of modifications, Your Grace?" Charlotte asked, though she feared the answer. "I want you to continue encouraging their intellectual development, their emotional growth, and their natural curiosity. But I also want you to ensure that they understand the weight of their responsibilities and the expectations that society will place upon them." "Your Grace, I believe I have been doing exactly that. You have been teaching them to question those expectations rather than simply accept them," the Duke interrupted. "Miss Pemberton, while I value independent thought, I also recognize that my children will need to navigate a world that may not always appreciate such independence." Charlotte felt a chill of apprehension at his words. "So, Your Grace, are you asking me to suppress the very qualities that make your children remarkable? I'm asking you to teach them when and how to express those qualities appropriately," the Duke clarified. "Miss Pemberton, my children will inherit positions of tremendous power and responsibility. They need to understand not just what they believe, but how to implement those beliefs in a world that often resists change." Before Charlotte could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside the study. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, and what sounded suspiciously like Lady Pemberton's imperious tones suggested that something significant was occurring. "Your Grace," came Mrs. Crawford's voice through the door, "I apologize for the interruption, but there is a situation that requires your immediate attention." The Duke opened the door to reveal his housekeeper looking more flustered than Charlotte had ever seen her. "What sort of situation, Mrs. Crawford?" "It concerns the children, Your Grace. Lady Pemberton discovered them in the East Wing, and she is most displeased with what she found." Charlotte and the Duke exchanged glances before hurrying toward the East Wing, where they found Lady Pemberton standing in the doorway of what had once been the late Duchess's private sitting room, her face white with shock and indignation. "Your Grace," she said without preamble, "I found your children in this room, engaged in activities that I can only describe as sacrilegious to your wife's memory." Charlotte peered over Lady Pemberton's shoulder and felt her heart clench at what she saw. The three children were seated on the floor of their mother's former sitting room, which had been kept exactly as it was at the time of her death. Lady Margaret was reading aloud from what appeared to be a journal, while Lord James and Lady Catherine listened with rapt attention. "They are reading their mother's private writings," Lady Pemberton continued with obvious horror. Your Grace, this room has been preserved as a shrine to the late Duchess's memory, and these children have invaded it as if it were a common playroom. Children, the Duke said quietly, please explain what you are doing here. Lady Margaret looked up with tears in her eyes but no shame in her expression. Papa, we found Mama's journals in her writing desk. We wanted to remember her as she really was, not just as the perfect Duchess everyone talks about. Miss Pemberton said we should carry Mama's love with us, not her sorrow, Lord James added, with the kind of earnest sincerity that made Charlotte's heart ache. We thought if we read her words we could understand what made her happy. And what have you discovered? The Duke asked, his voice carefully controlled. Little Lady Catherine scrambled to her feet and ran to her father, clutching a leather-bound journal to her chest. Papa, Mama wrote about us all the time. She wrote about how much she loved watching us play, how proud she was when we learned new things, how she hoped we would grow up to be happy and kind and brave. She wrote about you too, Papa, Lady Margaret said softly. She wrote about how much she loved your laugh, how she missed you when you travelled, how she hoped you would always remember to find joy in little things. Charlotte watched the Duke's face as his children shared these revelations, seeing the pain and wonder warring in his expression. For 2 years he had preserved this room as a monument to loss, but his children had transformed it into a celebration of love. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said with obvious disapproval, this is exactly what I meant about inappropriate behaviour. These children have violated the sanctity of their mother's memory by treating her private thoughts as entertainment. They have not violated anything, the Duke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. They have found their mother again. Papa, Lady Catherine said, tugging on his coat, Mama wrote that she hoped you would teach us to dance the way you taught her. She said dancing made her feel like she was flying. And she wrote about the garden she was planning, Lord James added eagerly. She wanted to create a place where the whole family could spend time together, where we could have picnics and read stories and just be happy together. She wrote about wanting to travel with us, Lady Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. She wanted to show us the places she loved, to teach us about different cultures and languages. She had so many dreams for our family, Papa. Charlotte watched as the Duke sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this flood of memories that his children had uncovered. For 2 years he had focused on his wife's death, on the tragedy of her loss, but his children had found her life, her hopes, her dreams for their future together. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said with growing frustration, surely you can see that this emotional display is exactly what I warned you about. These children have been encouraged to indulge their feelings rather than maintain proper restraint. These children have been encouraged to love their mother rather than simply mourn her, Charlotte said, finding her voice at last. Lady Pemberton, they are not indulging their emotions. They are healing from a loss that has defined their entire lives. Healing is not the responsibility of children, Lady Pemberton replied coldly. Their responsibility is to honor their mother's memory through appropriate behavior and proper respect for their station. Their mother's memory is honored every time they laugh, every time they learn something new, every time they show kindness to others, the Duke said suddenly, his voice carrying a strength that had been missing for months. Lady Pemberton, my wife would have been heartbroken to see what I allowed my children to become in the name of honoring her memory. Your Grace, surely you cannot mean— I mean that Miss Pemberton was right, the Duke interrupted, rising from his chair with new determination. I have been so focused on preserving the past that I forgot to prepare for the future. I have been so afraid of losing my wife's memory that I nearly lost my children's spirits. Charlotte felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched this man finally choose life over death, love over fear, hope over despair. Papa, Lady Catherine said softly, Miss Pemberton says that the best way to honor Mama is to become the people she would have wanted us to be. Is that true? Yes, sweetheart, the Duke said, kneeling down to gather his youngest daughter into his arms. That is absolutely true. Then can we try to make Mama's garden, the one she wrote about in her journal? We can do more than try, the Duke said, with the first genuine smile Charlotte had seen from him since her arrival. We can create exactly the kind of family space she dreamed of. We can have picnics and read stories and dance together the way she wanted us to. Your Grace, Lady Pemberton said with obvious horror, you cannot be serious. Such behavior would be completely inappropriate for a family of your standing. Such behavior would be completely appropriate for a family that chooses love over convention, the Duke replied firmly. Lady Pemberton, I appreciate your concern, but I have made my decision. Miss Pemberton will continue as my children's governess, and we will implement the kind of education and family life that my wife would have wanted for our children. Your Grace, the scandal will be far less damaging than the tragedy of raising children who are afraid to live, the Duke said with finality. Lady Pemberton, I thank you for your visit, but I believe our conversation is concluded. After Lady Pemberton's indignant departure, the Duke turned to Charlotte with an expression that combined gratitude, apology, and something that might have been admiration. Miss Pemberton, I owe you an apology. I have spent weeks doubting your methods when I should have been celebrating their results. You have given my children something I thought they had lost forever, the ability to be happy while still honoring their mother's memory. Your Grace, I was so afraid that Lady Pemberton's concerns would convince you to return to the old ways. The old ways nearly destroyed my children, the Duke said quietly. Miss Pemberton, you have shown me that grief and joy are not mutually exclusive, that remembering the dead does not require forgetting how to live. Papa, Lord James said suddenly, Miss Pemberton taught us that being noble means using our advantages to help others. Could we perhaps invite some of the tenant children to share lessons with us sometimes? Mama wrote that she believed all children deserved the chance to learn. Charlotte held her breath, waiting to see how the Duke would respond to this suggestion that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I think that is an excellent idea, the Duke said after a moment's consideration. Your mother would have loved the thought of Ravenshollow becoming a place where all children could learn and grow together. And could we have music lessons? Lady Margaret asked eagerly. Mama wrote about loving to play the pianoforte, and I should like to learn her favorite pieces. And dancing lessons? Lady Catherine added hopefully, so we can learn to fly the way Mama did. We can have all of those things, the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion. We can create the kind of home your mother dreamed of, a place where learning and laughter go hand in hand, where duty and joy support each other rather than competing. Charlotte watched this transformation with a sense of wonder and gratitude that left her speechless. The grieving widower who had hired her to maintain order had become a father ready to embrace the beautiful chaos of truly living. The solemn children who had been afraid to express joy had become young people eager to honor their mother's memory by embracing the life she had given them. Miss Pemberton, the Duke said, turning to her with an expression that made her heart race, I hope you understand that your position here is secure for as long as you wish to stay. You have given my family something precious, the courage to live again. Your Grace, it has been my privilege to work with your children. They are remarkable young people who simply needed permission to be themselves. They are remarkable because you saw their potential when I was too blinded by grief to recognize it, the Duke said softly. Miss Pemberton, you have saved my family in ways I'm only beginning to understand. As Charlotte looked around the room that had been transformed from a shrine to loss into a celebration of love, she realized that her first week at Ravenshollow Court had indeed shocked the entire court, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of scandal, she had brought healing. Instead of impropriety, she had brought joy. Instead of chaos, she had brought the kind of order that came from love rather than fear. The widowed Duke who had hired her to maintain the status quo had discovered that some changes were worth any amount of social disapproval, and the governess who had been sent to educate 3 heirs had ended up teaching an entire family how to live again. 6 months later, the gardens of Ravenshollow Court bloomed with unprecedented beauty in the spring sunshine, transformed from the neglected wilderness Charlotte had first encountered into the family paradise that the late Duchess had envisioned in her private journals. Children's laughter echoed across the carefully tended plots, where Lady Margaret's mathematical precision had created perfect geometric patterns. Lord James's practical leadership had organized efficient growing systems, and Lady Catherine's artistic eye had arranged flowers in combinations that brought joy to everyone who saw them. Charlotte stood at the window of what had once been the late Duchess's sitting room, and was now the family's favorite gathering place, watching as the Duke taught his children the waltz steps their mother had loved so much. The formal, grief-stricken man who had hired her had been replaced by a father who understood that the best way to honor his wife's memory was to embrace the life and love she had wanted for their family. Miss Pemberton, came Lady Margaret's voice from behind her, the tenant children have arrived for this afternoon's lessons. Shall we begin with mathematics or natural history? Charlotte turned to see the 12-year-old who had blossomed from a frightened, repressed child into a confident young woman with a passion for learning and a gift for teaching others. The integration of tenant children into the estate's educational programs had been one of their most successful innovations, creating bonds between the classes that would serve the future Duke well in his leadership role. "Let's begin with natural history," Charlotte suggested. "Lord James has prepared an excellent presentation about crop rotation that I think everyone will find fascinating." "And after lessons, we're having a picnic in Mama's garden," Lady Catherine announced, as she burst through the door with the kind of exuberant energy that had been missing from her life for so long. "Papa says we can invite everyone, the tenant children, the servants who want to join us, even Mrs. Crawford." Charlotte smiled at the thought of the dignified housekeeper participating in one of their informal family gatherings. Mrs. Crawford had initially been scandalized by the changes at Ravenshollow, but she had gradually come to appreciate the warmth and joy that had replaced the cold formality of the mourning period. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. Has your father finished his correspondence for the day?" "He's in the study with some gentlemen from London," Lord James said as he joined them, his arms full of the charts and diagrams he had prepared for his presentation. "They're discussing his proposals for educational reform in Parliament. Papa says that what we've accomplished here could serve as a model for other estates throughout England." Charlotte felt a surge of pride at the news. The Duke's transformation from a grief-stricken recluse to a progressive leader had been one of the most remarkable aspects of Ravenshollow's Renaissance. His speeches in Parliament about the importance of education for all classes had earned him recognition as one of the most forward-thinking members of the House of Lords. "Miss Pemberton," Lady Margaret said thoughtfully, "do you ever regret coming to Ravenshollow? I know it must have been difficult to face all the criticism from people like Lady Pemberton." Charlotte considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had indeed brought challenges: social disapproval from some quarters, criticism of her methods from traditional educators, and the constant pressure of proving that joy and learning could coexist with proper preparation for aristocratic responsibilities. "I have never regretted a single moment," she said finally. "You three have taught me as much as I have taught you. You've shown me that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a little girl standing up to defend what she believes is right. Sometimes it's a boy questioning assumptions that have never been questioned before. Sometimes it's a young woman choosing to embrace her intelligence rather than hide it. And sometimes it's a governess willing to risk everything to help children remember how to be happy," came the Duke's voice from the doorway. Charlotte turned to see him watching them with the warm smile that had become his default expression since the day his children had found their mother's journals and helped him find his way back to life. "Your Grace, how did your meetings go?" "Very well indeed," the Duke replied, moving to join their little group by the window. "The Education Committee is quite interested in implementing some of our innovations on a broader scale. It seems that Ravenshollow Court has become something of a sensation among progressive thinkers." "A good sensation, I hope?" Charlotte asked with a smile. "The best kind," the Duke confirmed. "Miss Pemberton, you should know that your methods are being studied by educators throughout England. The integration of different social classes, the emphasis on practical application of learning, the recognition that emotional well-being and intellectual development are inseparable. These ideas are revolutionizing how we think about education. It's not my methods that are revolutionary, Your Grace. It's your willingness to put your children's happiness and development above social conventions. That kind of courage is what creates real change." "Papa," Lady Catherine said suddenly, "Miss Pemberton has been here for 6 months now. Does that mean she's part of our family?" The question hung in the air with an innocence that made it impossible to ignore. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm as she realized that the little girl had voiced something that none of them had been willing to address directly. "Lady Catherine," the Duke said carefully, "Miss Pemberton is certainly a very important part of our household, but is she part of our family?" Lady Catherine persisted with the kind of direct honesty that had become her trademark. "Because she feels like family to me. She loves us the way Mama would have wanted us to be loved." Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she realized that this child had articulated something she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. Somewhere in the process of helping this family heal, she had fallen in love, not just with the children she had been hired to educate, but with the man who had found the courage to choose love over fear. "Miss Pemberton," the Duke said quietly, "might I have a word with you privately?" As the children scattered to prepare for their afternoon lessons, Charlotte found herself alone with the Duke, in the room that had once been a shrine to the past and had become a celebration of the present. "Charlotte," he said, using her given name for the first time since her arrival, "I need to tell you something that I have been struggling to find the courage to say. Your Grace, you have given my children back their childhood, their joy, their hope for the future. But more than that, you have given me back my life. You have shown me that it is possible to honor my wife's memory while still embracing the possibility of happiness." Charlotte felt her heart racing as she began to understand what he was trying to say. "Your Grace, I have simply tried to do my job to the best of my ability. Your job was to educate my children," the Duke said with a smile that made her knees weak. "What you have done is heal my family and teach us all how to live again. Charlotte, you have become indispensable to our happiness, and I find myself hoping that you might consider making your position here permanent in a way that goes far beyond your role as governess." "What are you saying?" Charlotte whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I am saying that I love you," the Duke said simply. "I love your courage, your compassion, your unwavering belief that people can change and grow and become better than they were. I love the way you see the best in everyone, the way you fight for what you believe is right, the way you have made this house a home again." "Adrian," Charlotte breathed, using his given name for the first time, I love you too. I love your strength, your devotion to your children, your willingness to change when change was needed. I love the man you have become, and the father you have always been, even when grief made it difficult to show." "Then will you marry me?" Adrian asked, taking her hands in his with infinite tenderness. "Will you become not just my children's governess, but their stepmother? Will you help me continue the work we have started here, creating a family and a home based on love rather than duty, joy rather than obligation?" "Yes," Charlotte said through tears of happiness. "Yes, I will marry you, and I will love your children as if they were my own, and I will spend the rest of my life helping you prove that the best way to honor the past is to embrace the future." When Adrian kissed her, it was with all the passion of a man who had learned that love was not a betrayal of grief, but its ultimate triumph. And when Charlotte responded with equal fervor, it was with the joy of a woman who had found her true calling in healing hearts and nurturing souls. "Papa, Miss Pemberton," came Lady Catherine's voice from the garden below. "Are you coming to our picnic? We've been waiting forever." Adrian and Charlotte broke apart with laughter, realizing that their private moment had been observed by 3 pairs of eyes that sparkled with delight and approval. "We're coming, sweetheart," Adrian called back, "and we have some wonderful news to share with you." As they made their way to the garden where the children waited with barely contained excitement, Charlotte marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been sent to Ravenshollow Court to maintain order in a house of mourning, but instead she had brought the kind of beautiful chaos that came with truly living. Her first week had indeed shocked the entire court, but not with scandal or impropriety. She had shocked them with the revolutionary idea that children could be both properly educated and genuinely happy, that duty and joy were not mutually exclusive, that the best way to prepare young people for leadership was to teach them to value both wisdom and compassion. The widowed duke who had hired her to preserve the status quo had discovered that some changes were worth any amount of social disapproval. The governess who had been sent to educate 3 heirs had ended up teaching an entire family how to love again, and the children who had been trapped in artificial grief had learned that the greatest tribute to their mother's memory was to embrace the life she had given them with gratitude, joy, and hope. As they joined the children in the garden that bloomed with new life and endless possibilities, Charlotte knew that her real education was just beginning. She would spend the rest of her life learning how to be a wife, a mother, and a partner in the kind of love that transformed not just individual hearts, but entire communities. The woman who had shocked the court with her unconventional methods had become the heart of a family that would continue to challenge conventions, break down barriers, and prove that the most revolutionary act of all was simply choosing to love without fear, to live without reservation, and to believe that every child, regardless of birth or station, deserved the chance to become everything they were meant to be. If this tale of unexpected transformation, of hearts learning to heal through love and courage, and of a governess who dared to challenge the status quo touched your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have had the courage to stand up for what you believed was right, even when facing powerful opposition? Could you have helped a grieving family find their way back to joy? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories where love conquers convention and proves that the most beautiful changes often begin with someone brave enough to believe that things can be better. Thank you for joining us in the halls and gardens of Ravenshollow Court, and until our next romantic tale unfolds, remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is the courage to help others remember how to truly live.